Have you ever seen someone around you get their comeuppance? A netizen responded, my wife was giving birth, but due to amniotic fluid embolism, both mother and child were in critical condition and were rushed into the ICU. My mother-in-law stood at the door, crying in fear. Suddenly, someone came and nudged us, saying, we're from a film crew, shooting in the next room. Could you cry a little quieter? My mother-in-law and I stared at this person, not knowing what he was talking about. He told us that he was the assistant director of the crew, that they had rented a hospital ward to shoot a short drama, and that our crying was disturbing them, so he hoped we could hold back our tears. My mother-in-law broke down completely, crying and saying, my daughter is in there fighting for her life. What are you talking about? The assistant director, helpless, said, I know you are very sad, but you are delaying our work now. Please don't cause us any trouble. After saying that, he turned and left. My mother-in-law and I didn't want to deal with him. Who would deal with such a lunatic? But then, nurses from the ICU came and went, and we knew not to talk to them. My mother-in-law couldn't help it and asked a nurse if the person inside was saved. The nurse said they were still trying, and my mother-in-law couldn't help but cry again. Suddenly, there was an angry shout from the next room. Why are they still crying? Go and shut them up. The assistant director rushed out of the room again, helplessly saying to us, are you done? I said, my wife is in there fighting for her life. She's her mother. Can't she cry? He said, I understand and sympathize with you, but to be reasonable, our crew spends tens of thousands a day. Can you compensate for the delay? I was stunned. The hospital is not a place for filming. Can they spend money to build a set? Seeing that I wasn't speaking, he thought he was right and said, we have no reason to pay for your misfortune. Please go cry somewhere else, or we will have to make you leave. After saying that, he turned to leave again. I grabbed his collar. He hurriedly asked, what do you want? Are you going to hit me? I suppressed my anger and said, call your director or give me your superior's phone number. I will speak to them. The assistant director shook his head, sighed, and said, contacts in the entertainment industry are not something you can just get. Anyway, listen, if you cry again, I will make you leave. He shook off my hand and ran back into the ward. At that moment, the door to the emergency room opened again. A nurse handed me a document and asked us to sign it. I immediately had a bad feeling and felt dizzy. Gripping the document tightly, the nurse said that the amniotic fluid embolism had worsened and that the mother might not survive. They needed to perform an emergency C-section to save the baby. My mother-in-law was stunned, and I was also panicking, unable to catch my breath. I tried hard not to cry, but when I spoke, my voice was choked with sobs. Can't you save both? The nurse told us that it wasn't a matter of choosing between the mother or the baby, but that they had to at least save one. The mother was in critical condition, and they needed my signature for the surgery. My mind went blank as I signed the document. As soon as the nurse took the document, my mother-in-law went insane. She suddenly knelt on the ground, crying and kowtowing to the nurse, please, save my daughter. She's my only daughter. Please, take whatever you need from me. I'm her mother. I can give her everything. My mother-in-law cried and kowtowed, making the nurse feel sympathetic. She quickly said they would do their best and ran back into the emergency room. I wanted to comfort my mother-in-law, but I was also terrified, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. Suddenly, the ward door was slammed open again. The assistant director poked his head out, angrily shouting, we paid money for this. Are you going to let us film or not? He walked towards us furiously, as if we had committed some heinous crime. He pointed at my nose and said, do you not understand human language? Being reasonable doesn't work, does it? I'll tell you, you are in big trouble. I asked him, do you not have a wife or children? He said excitedly, I don't, but if my wife or children were in this situation, I wouldn't cause trouble for society. I sympathize with you, but that's not an excuse. My mother-in-law wiped her tears, crying loudly, how can you be so heartless? My daughter and grandson are still in danger. The assistant director, driven crazy, said, aren't you the heartless ones? Our crew costs tens of thousands a day to operate. Our funds are burning, and you are here crying. Fine, I'll show you what empathy is. He suddenly ran and kicked the emergency room door hard. With a loud bang, the door made a loud noise. My mother-in-law was frantic. She grabbed the assistant director's arm and said anxiously, are you crazy? The doctors are performing surgery inside. The assistant director said, well, we're filming too. Now you know how it feels to be disturbed. Do you understand the principle of not doing to others what you don't want done to you? I pointed at the emergency room and said dumbfoundedly, did you think about the doctors holding surgical knives to save my wife and baby before you kicked the door? The assistant director sighed and said, if that's the case, I would rather your baby not be saved. I was stunned. I asked, what did you say? He sneered and said, a child born into such an uneducated family won't have a future. Maybe the baby knows its fate and doesn't want to be born into your family. He didn't finish his words because I grabbed his collar. The assistant director hurriedly said, what are you doing? Are you going to hit me? He shouted loudly, and several crew members came out from the ward. The one leading them wore a baseball cap and impatiently asked us, can't you handle a simple matter? The assistant director immediately put on a fawning expression and said to the person, director, this person has been causing trouble. So this was the director. He came over with his man, frowned, and asked me, did you tell them about the matter? The assistant director immediately said, I was just about to. They righteously told me that they were supposed to shoot a scene where the female lead falls ill and the domineering CEO rushes to see her in a helicopter because of my mother-in-law's crying. The shooting schedule was delayed repeatedly, and the helicopter's rental time had run out. If they wanted to use it again, they would have to pay again, which would cost 20,000 yuan per hour. Their point was that I should pay for it because we caused the delay. At this point, the assistant director was spitting angrily, telling me, "I already told you, the crew's money is burning. Do you understand how huge this fund is? Because if you're wailing outside, we incurred losses, so pay up." One word, wailing, directly ignited my emotions. I punched the assistant director hard in the face, roaring, "I cry at your mother's funeral. Your mother is dead, but my wife won't die." The assistant director fell to the ground, covering his face and screaming in pain. My mother-in-law was also frantic. She grabbed the assistant director's clothes and said excitedly, "Who are you cursing to die? My daughter is fighting for her life in there, and you are cursing who to die." The assistant director, desperate, said to the director, "Director, I told you they wouldn't pay. They are just like this, unreasonable and stubborn." The director's face turned cold. He opened his mouth to speak, but the emergency room door suddenly opened. I saw a baby being wheeled out. The nurse came out and coldly asked, "Who kicked the door just now?" The assistant director immediately said, "How dare you question us? I should ask you. We paid a lot of money to rent the space from the hospital, and what kind of clearance work did you do?" The nurse glanced at him and then ignored him, anxiously saying to me, "The baby has hope, but we don't have a specialized neonatal intensive care unit here. We need to transfer the baby to the children's hospital, where they have a specialized ward." I hurriedly asked, "What about my wife?" The nurse said, "She is still in surgery. We need to transfer the baby to the children's hospital immediately. We have arranged an ambulance, and our director has already explained the situation to the children's hospital. One family member can accompany the baby, and there will be a bed as soon as you get there." My mother-in-law wiped her tears and said she would accompany the baby to the children's hospital. The nurse and she hurriedly pushed the bed to leave. But at this moment, the director suddenly reached out and grabbed the bed. He coldly said, "Pay up first, or no one leaves." My mother-in-law was furious, shouting, "Let go! Didn't you hear what the doctor said? The baby needs to be sent to the hospital immediately, or it will be in danger." The director sneered, "Even if the baby dies, it's your family's baby, not ours. I invested my savings in this drama, and now you are causing me losses. What if you run away? Pay up first." After saying that, his men surrounded the bed. The assistant director, also excited, said, "Right, no one leaves without paying. A bunch of uncultured people. Do you think society's good people will tolerate you?" The nurse was almost in tears, anxiously saying, "Are you crazy? The baby is in a critical condition and needs to be sent to the hospital immediately." The director coldly said, "Being pitiable doesn't give them the right to do whatever they want. I took out my savings to shoot this drama. Did I go around crying for sympathy? Everyone in this world suffers. Don't use your suffering as an excuse." The assistant director nodded, saying, "Yes, making mistakes comes with a price. You can't harm others just because you're pitiful." I clenched my fists, a surge of anger burning inside me. I coldly said, "Do I have to beat you all to death?" Hearing this, the director laughed. He waved his hand, and his men immediately surrounded me. He mocked, "Do you think you have more people than a film crew? Do you know how many people a crew has?" Just as I was about to act, my mother-in-law grabbed my arm. She cried, "Pay them. Now is not the time to fight." I gritted my teeth. My mother-in-law was right. She needed to accompany the baby, and I needed to stay in the emergency room with my wife. If I fought and got taken away by the police, there would be no one to sign for my wife during her critical moments. I could only take out my phone and transfer them 20,000 yuan, then said, "Let go. Let my child go to the hospital." The director nodded, saying, "Fine, but you still owe me 30,000 yuan. I was stunned. "What 30,000 yuan? He pointed at the assistant director and said, "You hit our man earlier. Do you think that comes for free?" I indeed hit the assistant director earlier when he said Weilin. I never thought they would use this as an excuse to ask for money. The assistant director spat out a mouthful of blood and said arrogantly, 30,000 yuan, or today's matter won't end. The nurse was desperate, saying, "Let go. The baby won't make it in time." The baby's face had already started to turn purple, but the director just glanced at it and shook his head, saying, "No, we were reasonable at first. They were the ones who bullied us. We are just defending ourselves now. Pay the 30,000 yuan, and I'll let go." I said, "I don't have 30,000 yuan. The director coldly said, "If you can't even afford that, how dare you let your wife give birth?" My mother-in-law cried, "Bosses, I'm begging you, my son-in-law really doesn't have that much money. He broke someone's leg earlier and paid a lot of money in compensation. We don't have much money left." Hearing this, the assistant director exaggeratedly said, "Wow, he even broke someone's leg." Director, she's trying to scare us. I'm so scared. The director couldn't help but laugh. "Auntie, do you understand the law? If he really broke someone's leg, he would have been in jail long ago." The nurse said, "It's true. I can testify. That person was treated in our hospital, and their family paid a lot of money to settle it." The director sneered. You've been speaking for them all along. I suspect you're in cahoots with them. The nurse was anxious. You've been bullying them all along. The assistant director immediately warned the nurse. Miss, don't comment without knowing the whole story. If you knew the loss their family caused us, you would stand on our side. At this moment, the director suddenly lifted his foot. He actually stepped on the baby's mobile bed, coldly saying, "Come on, you think you're tough? Break my leg if you dare." The nurse was furious, pushing the director and shouting, "Are you crazy? Your feet have bacteria. The baby is in danger." The director coldly said, "Not being born into such a family is also a relief. Listen, I'd pay up or kneel and apologize to my crew. Don't use the baby as an excuse." I clenched my fists, barely containing my anger, but my mother-in-law shook her head, crying. I forced myself not to act rashly. If I missed my wife's critical moment because of these people, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I could only grit my teeth and ask, "If I kneel, will you let my baby go?" The director nodded. "Yes, just kneel." Enduring the humiliation, I finally knelt on the ground. I lowered my head, saying, "I'm sorry." They all laughed. The director said, "Director, you really have a way to control them." The director said lightly, "You need evil to deal with evil. Don't try to reason with them. It won't work." The nurse looked at the baby's condition, crying, "Can we let the baby go now? It's running out of time." The director said lightly, "Wait a moment, let me think about our losses." I roared, "You said kneeling would be enough." The director said, "Yes, I forgave you for hitting him, but I need to calculate all the losses you've caused us." My mother-in-law was trembling with anger. She suddenly raised her hand and bit her wrist hard. Blood dripped from her mouth, shocking the director and his men, who stepped back. The director said, "What are you doing? Are you threatening us with self-harm?" My mother-in-law cried, "Can I let my baby go now? If I die here today, you won't be able to avoid responsibility." The director and his men were stunned. Then the director suddenly laughed. He said, "Indeed, a family of rogues. Do you think you can extort us this way?" The assistant director sighed. What a weird family. At this moment, the emergency room light went out. We were all stunned. Turning to look at the door, the doctor came out and, seeing us, was first stunned. "Why haven't you sent the baby away? What are you doing?" The nurse anxiously said, "Director, they have a conflict with the patient's family and are being unreasonable." The director interrupted the nurse. "Don't talk nonsense." They kept crying, delaying our shooting schedule. "We paid for this." The doctor angrily said, "Who said you can't cry at the IC door? That's a conflict between you and our business department. You, a small director, don't dare to fight with the business department. So you bully ordinary people here. The money you spent wasn't for the patients. What right do you have to demand from the patient's family, who let the crew in? Don't you have your own set?" The nurse whispered, "Director, they have connections." The doctor pushed the director hard, saying, "Even with connections, they have to shoot in their own set. Get out immediately. Whoever signed the contract, let them find me." The director hurriedly whispered, "Director, please, I spent a lot of money shooting the scene. Let me finish, and we'll leave immediately." The crew clearly didn't dare offend this director, and finally made way. The director glared at me, gritting his teeth. "Fine, consider me unlucky to meet you." I hurriedly asked the doctor, "Doctor, my wife," before I could finish. My mother-in-law cried, "Don't ask." She wiped her tears, pushing the baby away, crying hoarsely, "Don't ask yet. I still need to take the baby to the hospital. I don't want to know. I'm afraid it's bad news. I'm afraid I can't handle it." I bit my lip and didn't ask further. After my mother-in-law left, I asked the doctor, "My wife." The doctor lowered his head, sighing, "We tried our best. I'm sorry." He shook his head regretfully and left. At that moment, I felt the world spinning. I walked dumbly into the emergency room. My wife had already been covered with a white cloth. She lay on the bed, and I trembled as I reached out. Looking at her pale face, she hadn't even closed her eyes. The assistant director stood at the door, watching the scene, clicking his tongue. "She's really dead." My prediction came true. The director coldly pointed at me, saying, "Cry quietly. We still need to shoot, and we're almost done." They turned and left. Seeing the doctor return to the office, the assistant director didn't forget to shout in the direction where my mother-in-law had left, "Hey, your daughter didn't make it. She's dead." Immediately, they all burst into laughter. The director punched the assistant director's shoulder, laughing, "You're so bad." The assistant director chuckled, "I'm just following your advice. Dealing with people like this, you can't be polite." I sniffed, picked up a bloody scalpel, and walked up behind the assistant director, grabbing his shoulder. He turned around impatiently, saying, "Is this still not over? Didn't we already let your child go?" The director glanced at me coldly, saying, "Be polite. This man just lost his wife and broke someone's leg." Hearing this, they burst into laughter. The assistant director laughed hysterically. "Right, I'm so scared, I could die laughing. Oh, my mouth is going to split open from laughing." He laughed uncontrollably until the corner of his mouth split open, extending to his ear. His jaw dislocated, and he stupidly held his jaw, exposing his molars, gums, and throat. The assistant director stared dumbly at his own jaw, with blood gushing out wildly. I acted so quickly that he didn't even feel the pain. The people around were already dumbfounded. I coldly said, "Is it split open?" "I fulfilled your wish." I threw the scalpel away, grabbed his hair, and dragged him into the ward. He was so scared, grabbing my arm, his legs kicking frantically, blood constantly pouring from his mouth. I said, "You won't die quickly." I asked before, "Do I have to beat you all to death?" The director panicked, but he didn't come forward. Instead, he stepped back and said excitedly, "Help him." The people he brought were also standing by, not daring to move. The director cursed. He threw the knife. "There are so many of you. Don't be afraid. Help him." Only then did they reluctantly enter the empty ward. One of the big guys, being more courageous, grabbed my neck and pushed me against the wall. I couldn't match his strength, being easily pushed against the wall, hitting my back hard. Enduring the pain, I quickly grabbed my belt and pulled it out. He was still strangling my neck, angrily saying, "You messed with the wrong people." Seeing me being strangled, the director followed into the ward, furiously saying, "Hold him down. I'll call the police right now and send this scum to jail." I lifted the belt, and the big guy thought I was going to strangle him, so he blocked his arms in front of him. But I wasn't planning to strangle him. I had already said I wanted to beat them to death. I held the sharp belt buckle and stabbed it into his neck. Once, twice, thrice. On the first stab, the big guy's body jerked, losing strength. The others didn't realize what happened, because the big guy's body blocked the view. Seeing me gradually breaking free, the director anxiously said, "Hold him tight. Don't be afraid. We're defending ourselves." It wasn't until the blood from the big guy's neck flowed more and more that the director realized something was wrong. He hurriedly said, "What's going on? Check it out." The big guy opened his mouth, vomiting a mouthful of blood, and fell softly in front of me. As the big guy fell, I lunged at the director, who quickly dodged aside, but my target wasn't him. I kicked the door of the ward, closing it shut. I reached out and locked the door. They hadn't figured it out yet. I wasn't here for a fight. I wanted to beat them to death. The assistant director, holding his face, glanced at the big guy on the ground, then started crying frantically. The director swallowed hard, saying, "Don't do anything rash. Your child is still fighting for his life. If you kill someone, you'll be executed." I retracted the belt, saying softly, "Last week, my wife came for a checkup. Someone drunk driving crashed into our car. To avoid responsibility, they tried to hit my wife. I dragged him out and broke his leg. The other party was also drunk and didn't want to call the police. The settlement was that we had to pay tens of thousands, but I haven't paid yet." He swallowed and asked, "What do you mean?" I smiled. "We were too naive and got tricked." He waited until the alcohol wore off and insisted he wasn't drunk, demanding we pay 400,000 yuan or he'd sue us. I didn't want my wife to worry, so I kept it from her. My mother-in-law also thought I only had to pay tens of thousands. "Tell me, where can I get 400,000 yuan?" The director said softly. "I don't understand what you're saying." I said, "If I get executed, I won't have to pay. All our property is in my parents' name. They would sell the house to save me. But if I die, they can't refuse to acknowledge the debt, and my child will live better." At this moment, the director was on the verge of tears, saying, "You're still young. Don't do anything rash. You can remarry if your wife dies. We can sit down and talk it out. Don't act rashly." I shook my head. "The person who gave me hope is dead. I have no interest in living." "When you bullied people at the ICU door, didn't you think that the people crying there are all hopeless?" After the big guy fell, there were only 2 people left to help the director, but looking at the bloody big guy on the ground, they were already scared out of their wits, huddling in the corner, not daring to move. They opened the window, looking down, seemingly wanting to jump but not daring to since it was the 4th floor. Finally, they shouted for help by the window. I ignored their cries for help, walking towards the assistant director. He wailed, trying to speak but unable to, his hands shaking, begging for mercy. I sighed and said, "Your blood is staining the floor." He was stunned. I said, "Didn't you say you wouldn't trouble society? Now you're making a mess. Can you clean it up?" He was scared senseless, kowtowing and crying. I shook my head. "Stop apologizing. It won't work. You don't even know what you did wrong. You're just afraid of the punishment. A man should keep his word. I said I'd beat you to death, and I will." The assistant director stared at me in despair. In this atmosphere of despair, the director finally couldn't take it anymore. He shouted, "Don't be cowards. He's serious. Let's all attack together, or none of us will survive." The assistant director and the 2 others turned to look at him, fear on their faces. For any normal person, it's impossible to remain calm in this situation. These grown men were already crying. The director gritted his teeth. "Don't you understand? We have a chance if we all attack together. If we go one by one, he'll kill us all. Attack together. I'll lead." He shouted and indeed charged at me. The other 2 followed him, rushing at me. The assistant director in front of me seemed to gather great courage, tightly hugging my legs, shouting loudly. But at this moment, a sudden change occurred. When the 3 of them attacked me together, the director bypassed me quickly and grabbed the door handle, unlocking it and escaping. Seeing the director run, the other two were stunned, then quickly followed. Only the assistant director was left, stupidly hugging my legs. He hurriedly tried to run, but I grabbed him back, saying softly, "You think you can escape?" I grabbed his head, smashing it against the wall. The assistant director struggled, crying and shouting, but his strength weakened. I kept smashing his head, coldly saying, "You think you're reasonable? You thought I was bullying you. Fine, now I'm bullying you for real." He lay on the ground, barely breathing. I didn't stop, picking up a nearby chair and saying, "Take out your phone. I'll give you a minute to leave a message for your parents." He cried, unable to speak, his hands shaking, begging for mercy. I sighed, waving my hand impatiently. "Hurry up, you have a minute. I said I'd beat you to death." He hesitated, trying to get up but too weak. He crawled slowly, leaving a trail of blood. I sighed, "Don't you care about the janitor? You weren't like this before. You said you wouldn't trouble others. Now you're being selfish, not considering the janitor." The assistant director cried even harder. He didn't leave a message for his parents. I raised the chair, smashing it on the back of his head. Once, twice, thrice. I didn't stop until the chair was completely broken and the assistant director was lifeless. I finally threw away the chair leg. I panted, rubbing my waist. The intense movement made my back and waist ache. I stretched my arms, walked to the door of the ward where the film crew was shooting. I knew the director and his men had run in here. Everyone knows that in times of danger, running into a crowd, it gives the most sense of security, especially when that crowd knows you. The sense of security doubles. This was their subconscious reaction. Hiding in the ward and locking the door. They probably had already called the police. I looked at the fire extinguisher in the cabinet on the wall, broke the glass, took out the extinguisher, and walked to the ward door, smashing the glass on the door. Inside, there were indeed many people, all staring at me in horror. The director and the two helpers were hiding in the corner of the ward. When the director made eye contact with me, he shivered. I said, "Debts have a debtor. Hand them over, or you all die." The people inside panicked. The director quickly said, "Don't fall for his tricks. There are so many of us. Don't be afraid." I asked, "Director, you were righteous when reasoning with me. Now I want to reason with you." The director shivered and asked, "What?" I asked, "For your own sake. You put so many people in danger. Do you think you are right?" He said softly, I won't argue with you." I sighed and said to the two helpers, "You two just stood behind cheering. Hand him over and kneel to apologize. You two will be fine." The director panicked and shouted, "Don't listen to him. He's bluffing. There's only one of him. So many of us. He can't beat us." I opened the fire extinguisher and aimed it inside, activating the switch. The dry powder extinguisher immediately filled the ward. The people inside coughed, screamed, and choked. In the small space, the dry powder extinguisher tortured their lungs. Finally, someone couldn't take it and cried out, "We'll open the door. Stop spraying. We'll open the door." In the white mist, someone opened the door. In an instant, the two helpers dragged the director out, rolling and crawling. Seeing me, they quickly knelt down, crying and begging for mercy. I ignored them and looked at the director. He was in a sorry state, covered in white powder, crying, "Brother, do we have to make it like this? We didn't kill your wife." I said, "You didn't kill my wife, but you chose to be the one to die when I had no will to live. That's all. I ask you, when a patient is at the brink of death, do family members have the right to cry?" He cried, "Yes, it was my fault." "You have the right?" I asked again. "When my child needed to be rushed to the hospital, did you have the right to stop them?" He cried again, "No, I won't dare to offend you anymore. I wish your child a long and safe life. Please spare me." I smiled. They no longer had their initial arrogance. They came with the crew's banner, used to acting domineering, thinking everyone would accommodate them, showing off their arrogance. But no matter what status one has, they shouldn't provoke someone who doesn't want to live. I said, "Sorry, I don't like your blessing, because you don't deserve to bless my child." I raised the fire extinguisher, and at this moment, the director suddenly moved, stabbing me in the stomach with a scalpel he picked up from the ground. I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. He grinned, "This is self-defense. Your biggest mistake was dropping the knife." I shook my head. "I didn't make a mistake. Without her, I can't live. This is my right choice." The director was stunned, and I smashed the fire extinguisher on his head. The director, covering his head with one hand and holding the scalpel with the other, stabbed my abdomen several times. I watched the scalpel stab into my stomach repeatedly, pulling out with blood each time. I felt a sense of relief. Finally, the director fell to the ground, screaming in pain, but I didn't stop. I kept smashing the fire extinguisher on his head. At first, the director screamed and struggled, but gradually, he had no strength left to resist. Until the director completely died, the hospital security had arrived. They stood at a distance, dumbfounded, each earning a monthly salary of 3,000 yuan, none willing to risk their lives for this. I held my abdomen, sitting on the ground, feeling weaker and weaker, my vision blacking out. I struggled to get up, dragging my dying body towards the emergency room. Along the way, I staggered and stumbled. When I finally reached the bedside, I looked at my wife on the bed, reached out, and gently touched her face. I said, "Why didn't you close your eyes when you fell asleep?" I lowered my head, kissing her deeply. I gently closed her eyes with my hand. I hugged her, climbing onto the bed, whispering. Coincidentally, we both had our bellies cut open. Although you always thought my jokes weren't funny. I hugged her, trying to smell her hair, but I was so tired that I couldn't even smell anything. She was originally cold, but her temperature gradually matched mine. I held her hand, whispering in her ear. My brother never had children. He went to the hospital, and the doctor said there was no way. He really wanted to have a child. If our child survives, he will take good care of them for us. I hugged her tightly, biting my lip, continuing to whisper. But if the baby doesn't survive, can we be reunited as a family of 3? Bah, I'm being pessimistic. It won't come true. I pressed my face against hers, feeling a surge of sadness. I sobbed softly. Every time I said something wrong, you would cover my mouth. Why aren't you covering it this time? I held her hand against my face, just like when she was alive. I felt so tired, unable to say another word. I could only hold her tightly, letting my consciousness drift away. Everything grew darker and darker. I couldn't hear any sounds or see anything, but I could feel her in my arms. This is a short story, and it ends here. I update my stories daily. If you like them, please subscribe.